Some prisons punish. These prisons erase. They turn bodies into numbers, time into torment, and dignity into dust. Welcome to the places even the devil would fear to enter. Prisons at their best are supposed to be instruments of justice. Confinement with rules, a chance at accountability, a framework that limits violence rather than unleashing it. But across continents, there are institutions that collapse into something else: industrialized cruelty, legal black holes, and economies of suffering. Over the next minutes we'll travel, in quick vignettes, through a dozen sites where incarceration crossed the line from punishment into something more like annihilation. If you want more investigations like this, hit subscribe now and stay with me. Start in Mongolia with a place cited in field reports as Urga. Imagine a cell not as a room, but a wooden coffin, plank walls, a narrow slot where food is pushed through, a single sliver of sky that never quite reaches you. Visitors who documented the site, including an author cited in the sources as Andrews, described prisoners living in box-like enclosures so tight and dark they were likened to human coffins. The sense of the place is claustrophobic. No sunlight, no privacy, deaths that went unnoticed for days because corpses could be concealed inside those wooden partitions. These are not dramatic escapes or riot scenes. They are slow erasures, people reduced to breath, reporting a mortality that felt like silence swallowing lives. Why would even the devil fear a place like this? Because it's not a test of punishment, it's the quiet making of oblivion. Turn now to São Paulo, Brazil, and the wound the world came to know as Carandiru. In 1992, an operation by law enforcement ended in a massacre inside those walls. The event is infamous, and the death toll reported in the sources varies by account. What remains constant in witness statements and journalistic reconstructions is the scale: overcrowding, a volatile mix of gangs and tension, and then an eruption of force that killed scores of people. The prison itself had become a pressure cooker, hundreds packed into spaces designed for far fewer, health and hygiene collapsing, and power brokers within the prison running parallel systems of order. That night, the state acted as judge, jury, and executioner in the eyes of many observers. Carandiru crosses the line when the apparatus meant to control violence adopts violence on a mass scale, and when accountability for that transformation vanishes into institutional silence. Go south across the Atlantic to Rwanda, to a town called Gitarama, where the aftermath of genocide turned cells into mass graves. After 1994, detainees arrived in overwhelming numbers. Prisons designed for hundreds held thousands. Disease and hunger spread like wildfire. Reports compiled from survivors and humanitarian observers describe long lines for water, makeshift bedding on concrete, and bodies piled where there were once benches. Some accounts, careful to note the sensitivity of the topic, even reference episodes of cannibalism, always framed as reported and rooted in extreme starvation rather than sensationalized anecdote. Entire contingents of prisoners died within weeks, buried in collective graves under earth that swallowed both names and stories. When a prison becomes a morgue by neglect and the walls contain nothing but the economy of death, it becomes a place that warps the very point of confinement. Across the ocean again in Paris, La Santé carries a different kind of horror: isolation and despair. A physician referenced in the sources as Véronique Fife documented a troubling pattern: elevated suicide rates, deep depression, and a design that amplifies solitude. Imagine corridors that echo, cells that trap sound and thought, and a system that responds to mental illness with confinement rather than care. The sensory detail is small but telling. The smell of damp and stale air, the persistent clink of metal keys, the worn mattress that has held too many bodies without adequate medical attention. When medical professionals start to sound alarms about the very architecture of a facility, you see why the place becomes more than a building. It becomes a machine that grinds at the mind. La Santé crosses the line when punishment ceases to be about consequence and becomes a slow, inward violence. In El Salvador, an experimental form of control became its own instrument of suffering. Tecoluca, sometimes referenced with the acronym SIOT in reports, is part of a strategy that aimed to break gang power by enforcing near-total isolation. Detainees described being locked down for reported stretches approaching 23.5 hours a day, with the state intentionally mixing rival members to disrupt hierarchies and punish alleged leaders. The result was a legal and moral blender. Isolation amplified paranoia and mental collapse, while the mixing of rival groups invited targeted violence. Here, the mechanism of control is a policy that weaponizes solitude and social fracture. A system designed to dismantle gangs instead manufactured new forms of brutality that seeped out beyond the walls and into families and communities. Venezuela's Sabaneta presents the opposite problem, when the state fails to maintain monopoly on force inside its own walls. Prisoners and human rights observers described a facility where inmate factions rule, where guards take bribes and basic life necessities are up for purchase. Imagine corridors governed not by law but by pay-to-play systems. You get access to decent food, bedding, or protection only if someone on the inside can afford to buy it. Riots and violent uprisings punctuate the story of Sabaneta, and the sensory detail that sticks is the raw stench of desperation combined with a marketplace for survival. When a prison functions like a corrupt microeconomy and human life is priced, punishment slips into predation. Bolivia's San Pedro takes the prison economy idea to another level. This is a place described as quasi-privatized from within, where cells can be rented and wealthier inmates live in conditions resembling small apartments while poorer prisoners sleep in the squalor of overcrowded communal spaces. The vivid image is of a bartering system, guards and visitors transacting for comforts, outside networks operating like vendors, a hierarchy not set by law but by who can pay. Reports of contraband openly moving through the corridors and the existence of paid cells show a collapse of the concept of incarceration as a state-imposed equalizer. Instead, it becomes a mirror of social inequality, punitive for some, almost domestic for others. The moral line is crossed when incarceration institutionalizes inequality rather than addressing it. Return north to Russia and meet Black Dolphin, a facility designed to hold the country's most dangerous offenders. The architecture of control here is exacting and relentless. Prisoners escorted in cuffs, walked bent over to prevent eye contact, under constant observation. The sensory detail is clinical. Concrete corridors, the steady shuffle of iron soles on stone, guards' voices that carry the authority of a place built both to isolate and to dehumanize. For those held in Black Dolphin, the punishment is totalizing. Every movement regulated, every sensory input monitored. That is a form of incarceration that claims to be about security, but produces a steady attrition on the human spirit. Even the most hardened conceive of fear, but a place where routine itself becomes terror is another kind of abyss. Bang Kwang in Thailand is often described with one image that will not leave the mind: chains. In certain sections, shackling practices and the use of heavy restraints endured for long stretches of time are reported. Add to that severe sentencing laws, overcrowding, and questions about nutrition and sanitation, and you have a recipe for constant physical strain. The smell of overcrowded cells, the sight of men sleeping shoulder to shoulder on concrete, the limited food rations. These details turn confinement into bodily punishment that survives beyond release. When the tools of custody are chains and deprivation, the purpose of incarceration shifts from rehabilitation or deterrence to prolonged suffering. Butyrka, an ancient Moscow institution, carries with it the weight of history and, in modern times, political controversy. The facility's age shows damp cells, mold creeping in corners, plumbing that fails under the pressure of too many bodies. The name appears in connection with high-profile detainees in the reports. Among the cases cited is Sergei Magnitsky, spelled in the source as Sergei Magnitsky, Sergei Magnitisk in variations, whose death in custody became an international scandal. Reports reference overcrowding and a system that sometimes appeared to treat pretrial detention as an indefinite limbo. Stories of attempted escapes, the kind of desperation that produced Houdini-like efforts, linger like folklore. Butyrka crosses the line when detention becomes indistinguishable from being lost to the system, when you enter and the clock of your life is no longer governed by law, but by procedural inertia and neglect. Kamiti Prison in Kenya demonstrates how public health collapses can turn incarceration into epidemics. Reports cite repeated cholera outbreaks and systemic failures in sanitation and healthcare. Block G, in particular, has been flagged as a site where sexual violence and extortion flourish under the radar. Inmates preyed upon because oversight is weak, reporting mechanisms broken. Visualize overcrowded wards, the buzz of flies, and a healthcare system that cannot respond in time. When a prison becomes a vector for disease and predation, rather than a regulated corrective environment, it entrenches harm that extends far beyond its gates. Colombia's La Modelo is a case where internal factional war becomes the defining feature. Control by armed groups and violent clashes, sometimes with weapons smuggled inside, have turned courtyards into battlegrounds. In the reporting, the name Elmer Fernandez appears as a figure tied to the institution's administration. The source notes his name in connection with broader issues of governance and the dangers administrators face. Testimonies describe cell blocks where rival factions negotiate power with bullets and intimidation, and where the state's failure to effectively separate combatants made daily life a high-risk proposition. When a prison becomes an arena for armed conflict, it forfeits any claim to being an instrument of measured justice. Across the Caribbean, at the U.S.-operated facility in Guantanamo Bay, the mechanism of cruelty is legal limbo. Detainees have been held for years without traditional legal recourse, in a space defined by extraordinary rendition, enhanced interrogation techniques, alleged by multiple human rights organizations, and the erosion of habeas corpus rights for some detainees. The sensory detail there is less about bricks and iron and more about time, days that stretch into a lawless horizon where one's status is undecided. Mental collapse, chronic anxiety and despair, and long-term psychological damage are consistently reported. Guantanamo crosses the line by creating a legal black hole, when punishment stops being a response to a crime and becomes perpetual uncertainty inflicted as strategy. Finally, a facility emblematic of modern isolation, ADX Florence in the United States. Designed as a supermax, ADX isolates inmates in small concrete cells, often for 23 hours a day, with minimal human contact and extensive sensory deprivation. The architecture is a calculation. Narrow hallways, solid doors, tiny windows, minimal stimulation. The human consequence is profound. Social death by tiny increments. People who spend years under such conditions report cognitive decline, severe depression, and a fraying of the sense of self. When the state designs incarceration around sensory and social deprivation as a standard operating procedure, it asks fundamental questions about what punishment is for and what it becomes when stripped of human contact. If we step back from each individual horror, patterns emerge. One mechanism is mass death by neglect, overcrowding, disease and starvation turning cells into graves, as in Gitarama or the overcrowded wings of many facilities. Another is the legal and temporal abyss, indefinite detention, where time itself becomes a method of punishment, epitomized by Guantanamo. A third is systemic dehumanization through isolation and sensory deprivation, with ADX Florence and Tekaluka exemplifying how enforced solitude fractures the mind. Then there's the economy of incarceration, prisons that mirror and magnify social inequality, turning daily survival into a marketplace as in San Pedro and Sabaneta. Finally, dynamic violence, when control devolves into factional rule, where inmates or officials wield lethal power with impunity, as witnessed in La Modelo, and tragically in Carandiru. Across these mechanisms runs a single moral thread. When incarceration stops being about proportionality and becomes about annihilation, the institution has shifted from justice to something resembling revenge, neglect, or structural violence. The human cost shows up in statistics, but first and foremost in faces and names. The reports we draw from give us several such human markers. An author named Andrews, who documented wooden boxes in Mongolia, Veronique 5. Gao, the physician who raised the alarm about suicides at La Sante. The name Sergei Magnitsky, rendered in some sources with spelling variations, whose death became a touchstone for conversations about detention conditions, and Elmer Fernandez, cited in connection with administration and violence at La Modelo. These names remind us that behind every policy and every architecture lies a person who suffered. We must also be careful with the tales we pass on. Some details in these accounts are complicated, spelled differently in different sources, or summarized from testimonies that vary in precision. Wherever a fact is uncertain, responsible reporting uses caution, phrasing like reported, according to accounts, and, as cited in sources, keeps us honest. That restraint does not make the stories less urgent. It preserves credibility while amplifying the moral imperative. So what do we do with this knowledge? First, we honor memory. Each of these facilities contains lives that would otherwise be forgotten, names erased, families left without closure. Remembering is a minimal form of justice. Second, we stay informed. Institutional cruelty rarely ends suddenly. It metastasizes when oversight collapses and public attention wanes. Third, we insist on dignity as the baseline of any penal system. Confinement does not require annihilation. Justice does not demand the erasure of personhood. These prisons, in different ways, cross a line that should be uncrossable, turning punishment into prolonged systemic suffering. They are not accidental failures. They often result from policy choices, corruption, neglect, or deliberate strategies that devalue human life. That is the core why even the devil, a figure of ultimate transgression, would recoil, because these places do not merely fence people in, they consume them. If one of these cases shocked you more than the others, tell us which in the comments and why. Share this video with someone who needs to hear these stories, not to shock for shock's sake, but to wake us to the real costs of systems that forget their humanity. If you haven't already, like and subscribe for more investigations that hold institutions to account and keep memory alive.